Good evening and a very warm welcome to the York Consortium for Conservation and Craftsmanship and to the second of our winter series of Second Tuesday talks. My name is Rebecca Thompson and I'm a member of the York Consortium Committee. So we launched the Second Tuesday talks following the success of our webinar Conservation and Craft Myths, which was held on the 16th of June last year in place of our planned AGM. We're pleased to have attracted a wide audience to the events of both the summer and winter series of talks, and as well as our members, we're delighted to welcome many non-members again tonight. So I hope that our regular participants will forgive me for saying just a few words about the consortium by way of introduction. So the consortium was established 20 years ago in recognition of York's central role as a hub for conservation and craft skills within the heritage sector. We've built upon this to emphasise the close integration between craftspeople and conservators and to provide a point of focus for both practitioners and those interested in supporting our heritage. The Foundation's annual bursary scheme has also flourished, and we've awarded over 250 bursaries to support the development of craft and conservation skills. So I'm delighted to welcome our speaker this evening, Martin Stancliffe. Martin has been chair of the York Consortium for Conservation and Craftsmanship since 2005. Martin is an architect specialising in the conservation of historic buildings and places, and from 1990 to 2011 he was a surveyor to the fabric of St Paul's Cathedral in London and is now Surveyor Emeritus. He founded his own architectural practice, Martin Stancliffe Architects, in York in 1979. Before his retirement, he worked extensively for cathedrals, churches, the National Trust, English Heritage, the Landmark Trust and major country houses. Extensive works at St Paul's Cathedral in London were awarded the RICS Project of the Year Award in 2009. It's really great to have you with us. We'll also be joined for Q&A session by Charles Hesp, who is also a member of the YCCC. Charles is a specialist decorator who started out as an apprentice sign writer in the 1960s and then moved on to decorative restoration work. He has the knowledge and skill of all the traditional crafts involved in decoration of grand interiors, but also makes use of modern technology where applicable. He's worked on stately homes throughout the country, all Yorkshire grand houses and British embassies throughout Europe. So before we hear Martin speak, there are a few housekeeping matters. We're not anticipating any issues, but if we do encounter any technical issues, please bear with us. You're welcome to submit questions during the presentation. You can do this by clicking on the Q&A icon, which should appear at the bottom of your screen when you move your cursor. We anticipate a finish time of around 8 p.m. But if there are outstanding questions, then for those that want to stay with us, we will continue for a few extra minutes to answer these. And now for Martin's talk, St Paul's Cathedral, Rescuing a Lost Architectural Scheme, the restoration of James Thornhill's tambour decoration.
Thank you, Rebecca. And it's very nice to be with you here this evening. And I'm going to talk this evening about the restoration of the tambour's decoration at St Paul's. It's a project which I thought might make an interesting little case study because it has significant elements of both craftsmanship and conservation in it. It employed at least two members of the York Consortium, myself and Charles Hesp. And it also deals with that interesting issue of restoration. I'm using restoration in its technical sense of putting back something which has been lost. You'll be first of all asking what on earth is a tambour, and a tambour and a drum are more or less the same thing. But at St Paul's, we always referred to the tambour as that bit of the cathedral which lifts the whole dome structure right high above the ground and above the rooftops of 18th century London, as Wren intended. During this short talk, I'm going to discuss what the context of this particular project was, try and explain to you what Wren's intentions are believed to have been for the decoration of this particular part of the cathedral, to look at what surviving evidence for decorative treatments there were, to ask and try and answer how on earth we could get up to this rather lofty position, at least 100 feet above the ground. What we could then see when we were there from close examination, and what we could discover when we started going beneath the surface, to find out what our objectives were for the project as a whole were, and to outline in brief form what the consents programme was required. Then how on earth did we go about selecting a contractor capable of delivering a project like this, before we knew that Charles existed, to go into what issues were encountered when the project was actually developed on site, and then finally to stand back at the end and see whether what we landed up with was what we expected. Here is this wonderful cross-section of St. Paul's Cathedral, as engraved by John Gwynne in 1756, i.e. half a century after Wren had actually stepped back from looking after the cathedral, and a considerable time after James Thornhill completed his work. During the first part of the 18th century, and indeed right through the 19th century, and indeed even into the 20th century, the idea that somehow St. Paul's had been left incomplete in that its decorative interior was never quite completed was bounced around amongst all sorts of different people. And what we do know is that this drawing, which was prepared by John Gwynne in 1756, shows a suppositional idea that he had for what would happen if he would get his way within the main body of the cathedral, which was never executed. And the part here above by James Thornhill, which we know was executed. We don't really know what Wren intended. He was very enigmatic about what he said about the proposed treatment of the interior of the dome. Everything that he seems to have hinted at was that he would have preferred, if you like, an architectural rather than a figurative kind of decoration there. He refers at one point to wishing that the cathedral could be completed with a mosaic in the manner of St. Peter's, which has a coffered ceiling mosaic in its dome. And we know that he respected the work of the ancients, as he called them, i.e. the Romans. And you can see here at the top of this picture an indication of what William Emmet, doing this engraving in 1702, thought that might be the kind of thing that Wren had in his mind. Of course, in 1702, the dome didn't even exist. Even the design of the dome hadn't been finalized in Wren's mind, because it was only constructed in the early years of the 18th century. So this isn't certainly what Wren finally intended. What was actually executed by Sir James Thornhill between about 1715 and 1719 was this: an upper part in the dome itself, which contained 12 histories, as they were called, i.e. acts taken from the Acts of the Apostles. And that was set within an architectural framework, which you can see here, this series of painted arches. And they were taken down, the actual architecture of the tambour, in a series of decorations applied also by James Thornhill, who was known to have been paid a certain sum for the dome and a rather lesser sum for the tambour. And if you look at this the detail of this very remarkable drawing by the Pugins, father and son, in 1828. In 1828, Augustus Welby Pugin, the younger Pugin, would only have been 16, but he was a very precocious draftsman, and this may well have been from his own hand at that time. But you can see here in this detail the crossed swords of the coat of arms of the Dean and Chapter, alternating with swags in these panels beneath the windows, festoon swags above the windows all the way round, and on the face of the pilasters, painted fluting. And that you can see here in this painting of the funeral of the Duke of Wellington was still extant in 1852. You can see here the panels, and you can just make out, I think, the fluting on the faces of the pilasters. All that painted work was painted out probably by Penrose, and probably by Penrose. FC Penrose took over as surveyor to the fabric in 1852 and was surveyor till about the end of the century. He actually painted out all that decorative work from the bottom of the dome right down to the Whispering Gallery here, between probably around 1858 to 9. And this is what survived to the end of the last century. This photograph was taken in the 1990s and represents what I was faced with when we were thinking about what we should do about the whole treatment of the dome and the timber area as part of a major project to clean the entire interior of the cathedral. And when you got up onto the Whispering Gallery and could look through a pair of binoculars actually up at the pilasters, you can see that these panels either side were painted out and there's no trace of the decorative treatment there. But if you look very carefully at the face of the pilaster here, I think you can just see, grinning through the paintwork, the shadow lines of the painted fictive fluting that Thornhill painted onto those pilasters. But how on earth do you get up there? Well, the Health and Safety Executive are slightly more attentive now than they were when E.T. Parris, who was employed to do conservation work to the dome in the 1850s. And this illustration from the Illustrated London News of the time shows him in his heroic stance as painter and conservator and restorer, balanced by ropes. And this is his remarkable drawing, actually, which remains in the archive at St. Paul's Cathedral, showing the scaffolding that he actually used to get himself up there. Its main issue is that it was, of course, a suspended scaffold. It was all hung from a series of fixed points through the dome structure, and in my view was always likely to have been constructed by riggers from the Port of London, which of course was only just down the hill from St. Paul's Cathedral. These are people who would have been used to swinging up yard arms and topmasts of the sailing boats of the period using a block and tackle technique. And that was how they got there. So that after a great deal of thought and head scratching about how we might get there, we came to the conclusion that they were onto the best idea, that actually to hang a scaffold from the top of the cathedral was probably a very effective way of doing it. It had various particular advantages. One, of course, was that it didn't have to be started from ground level, where it would have blocked the whole cathedral for 2 or 3 years while it was done. And the cathedral, of course, has to stay open for worship all the time and for visitors. And so that was out of the question. A second advantage was that actually it was more cost effective to do that because there was much less actual scaffolding employed in getting up there. And a third very important one was that the whole structure could rotate. And that had advantages which you will see in due course. I should say that the engineer who designed this, well, there were two engineers who designed it. Robert Bowles, who was the engineer for St. Paul's, who worked with me throughout the entire project, was one of those who masterminded the project, and a wonderful scaffolding engineer called Ray Gold, who I would pay tribute to here, who actually did the working drawings and worked out the detail of how this amazing scaffold would work. And here it is in the course of construction. I don't know whether you can just see the cable coming down from the very top of the lantern all the way down here. And that allowed this network of scaffold to be erected around it. And from that, the platforms taken out to reach the wall of the tambour and indeed of the dome above. As I say, one of the advantages of this particular kind of construction was so that it could rotate. And this time-elapse film was taken at the time, which is entertaining, but also informative to show the kind of principle of how it worked. Because, of course, there was one other great advantage to the scaffold, and that was that the Whispering Gallery, and indeed access up beyond the Whispering Gallery, up to the top of the dome, the Stone Gallery and the Golden Gallery, is a real, produce a lot of income for the Dean and Chapter. And the idea that as well as having to pay for all this expensive work to be done and lose the revenue of that particular income stream was not popular with the Dean and Chapter. And so they were very delighted at the idea that we could come forward with a scheme which allowed people to continue to get up there and go beyond this point, but also within the cathedral to be able to see, if not the entirety of the James Thornhill dome, at least a good proportion of it. Once you were up there on the scaffold, of course, you could begin to see all sorts of things that you couldn't see from ground level or even through binoculars. And in raking light, you can begin to see that the surface of a building like this can show you all sorts of different things. Here are marks made actually in the surface of the stonework, setting out what appears to be the beginning of a spiral, decorative treatment here. And also you can see here the brush marks that survive of a scheme below this stonework coloured paint which covers it all. And that was extremely informative in guiding us in what we could then begin to discover. One of the things that we discovered, we didn't really intend to discover, and that is that we found some traces of some sample panels that were clearly put up by FC Penrose during his surveyorship when he was putting forward proposals, as you see here on the right. Here is a watercolour drawing by Penrose, which shows a proposal for decorative treatment within the Whispering Gallery area. But interestingly, recording quite exactly the Thornhill painted dome and the decorative treatment that we've been talking about here. This was part of a huge national discussion, again, picking up the point that I referred to earlier on, that the idea that St. Paul's had been left incomplete and somehow that to cover it up with paintings of one kind or another might well be a thing that should be done in order to complete Wren's masterpiece. Heaven forbid, but that's a modern perception, of course. What we do know is that Penrose put forward various ideas, and here we find a trace of an inscription that he put up on the building as a sample. This isn't actually what was shown in this drawing, because actually where this bit is up at the top cornice level here and not down here, but it shows the general idea. What we did find, however, underneath the paintwork was the original paintwork of James Thornhill's timber decorative scheme. It has to be said that the paint with which Penrose covered it in the 1850s had adhered extremely strongly to the face of the paintwork underneath. And it took a conservator working with a minute scalpel simply ages to pick away bit by bit, so as to make quite sure that the original paintwork wasn't disturbed, but so that the original shape of the decorative treatment should be carefully revealed. And here you can see the hilt of one of the swords of the two cross swords being excavated by an archaeologist conservator. And that allowed the form of that cross swords to be revealed. Here is a sketch which was pinned over the top, which allowed the tip of the sword to be identified and actually to pick up in a little cross strip where the cross swords were. And the same treatment was then given to the swags, which were in the alternate panels underneath. Here is the knot at the corner of the swag with a piece of cloth hanging from it. And you can begin to see little excavations here to see whether there was a shadowing painted on beneath that moulding, and to try and pick out where other elements were within the picture as a whole. It was, as I say, very time-consuming and fiddly work, and took simply weeks of excavation to reveal the drop and then the second part of the swag over here. But eventually we got a whole swag clear, and we were able to pick up things again like the shadow lines up at the top and down at the bottom, and to see whether there was any detail adjacent to the edges. Picked up all the details. We couldn't do more than that, because it, as I say, it took a great deal of time and effort. And elbow grease isn't exactly the right word for picking away with a scalpel, but it's whatever that process is. But you can see that actually there was enough there to enable some kind of replication of what might be involved to be begun, to be drafted. That took us to a very critical stage in the project as a whole. I haven't talked about the consents that we required to get into this project, but very briefly, I mean, I'm responsible for having floated the concept of cleaning the whole of the interior of the cathedral, which was, in my opinion, filthy dirty, and luckily the Dean and Chapter agreed with me. So I put forward outline proposals for how we might go about this colossal task. And at a formative point, I suggested that we should have a seminar to invite key people to discuss these proposals as a preliminary to really defining what exactly we might do. And we invited representatives of our Fabric Advisory Committee, the Cathedral's Fabric Commission, English Heritage, the SBAB, some other cathedral architects, some experts of Wren scholarship, even some people from the continent who might give a wider kind of view than we could have within the UK. And we met for an entire day and had an extremely good discussion. I put forward very tentatively the idea that we might reveal the Thornhill timber decorations, because restoration is not always a very cozy word to live with these days. And so I approached it rather tentatively. But to my interest, a majority of the attendees at this seminar thought that actually that was a really good idea and should be given more prominence in our project planning as a whole. And so the consent, the outline consent for the project as a whole for cleaning the entire interior of the cathedral was approved in outline by the Cathedral's Fabric Commission on the condition that there were a number of identified stages at which we would have to come back to them to gain approval for each subsequent stage. That gave us the confidence to know that we could actually, plan in earnest and go ahead in earnest. And we then had to think how we could actually find a contractor who was capable of delivering the project. And we determined on a tender process. We went through a two-stage tender process, and the second stage tender process, which was limited, I think, to 4 different companies who we felt were able to deliver this kind of thing. And we asked them to submit 4 different things, one of which was a method statement, one of which was a costed schedule, one of which was a program, a time program. And the 4th element, which you can see here, is that each should submit a painted sample board. And that proved to be a very effective and interesting way of judging people, because you can see quite clearly here that this artist has approached it in a very different kind of way from this artist, much more meticulous. And what was interesting was that one set of sample boards stood out as having the fluency of the brush strokes that were very, very close to what Sir James Thornhill would have had, and indeed could be demonstrated by observing in the cathedral he did have. And that had, of course, 2 advantages to it. One is that it's much quicker to paint in a much freer way than in the much more meticulous way that this one shows. And the other, of course, is that it's therefore much cheaper to actually paint in that freer and more immediate kind of way. And it was Charles Hesp, who is with us here tonight, and I'd like to pay tribute to Charles, who was a terrific colleague and a terrific craftsman to work with, and I hope he'll take part in answering questions after I stop talking. But we chose him to be the artist painter, to make this project happen. And here is Charles on the scaffold, which is now erected, preparing sample boards with the swags that he was observing, getting the colours right, the tonalities right, and exploring the light as it was actually within the timbre itself. And looking at the traces of Thornhill's original work, which we had, as I've just shown, painstakingly uncovered, so that he could actually begin to map out how those swags might be placed on the cathedral itself. And then with his artist's palette in his hands, to go at it with a free brushstroke and paint and paint and paint. And great that he managed to keep going for about 1.5 years to go all the way around the timbre and do his wonderful work. Here is that swag complete, but before the shadowing was installed. And it's important to remind ourselves at this stage that, of course, above the timbre is this great dome. And in parallel with the project which I'm talking about this evening, another set of conservators, Payne and Stewart, were doing a different but related job on the existing great Thornhill painted dome. here are two of his team looking up in awe and amazement at the number of square meters of conservation work which they would be shortly about to be embarking on. But it's important that we bear this in mind at the time, because of course it had to be borne in mind throughout the project as a whole, because in order to arrive at the tonality and the colours that could be used for painting the new paintwork on the cornice and in the timbre, we had to know what the conservators would reveal as being the cleaned colours and tonalities that they could achieve within the dome above. And so here you see our first samples set where we were joining above and below to see whether we had got those tonalities and colour changes more or less right. And we could also stand on the cathedral floor below and look up at the what had been achieved. And this is where, when I pointed out how important it was that the scaffolding could move round, we could prepare this sample triple bay, double bay, and then move the scaffolding out of the way in order to be able to stand back and see whether we thought we had actually got it right or not. And that enabled us to meet the consultation and consent process and invite English Heritage and the Cathedral's Fabric Commission and so on to stand with us on the floor of the cathedral and look up and see whether we had got it right. And we made a few adjustments and were able to move the scaffold back again so that Charles Hesp could actually put those in. But that gave confidence to everybody concerned with the project, which allowed the CFCE and the Fabric Advisory Committee to give us the approval to go ahead. One element of that, which I had not totally foreseen, was the incredible importance of the fictive light and shadow scheme, which Thornhill had put into his painting above. In that, the light is always coming over your left shoulder, whether you're looking north, south, east, or west. And the effect of taking that and applying it to the architectural treatment of the timbre was, as you can see, very, very interesting indeed, in that it brought the architecture very much to life. And Charles, we used to stand on the scaffold together and laugh a good deal, because he pointed out to me the importance of what he called fictive reflected uplight, which we nicknamed FRU. And you can see here that he's painted a band of lighter colour here, which is the kind of light that the bounced uplight from the floor of the cathedral, bouncing off this gold moulding here, would shed within the shadow here. And the way that the shadow gradates here, just very subtly, and the colour that it goes through, are all marks of Charles's amazing artistic craftsmanship in this project. And you can see that when we actually looked at a bit of the completed cathedral treatment, you can see how compellingly it jumps out the treatment from the, what we've left untouched here. So we were able to stand back and say, did it kind of meet the objectives of the project as a whole? And we came to the very strong conclusion that actually it did do what we intended it to do. Here is the work as complete here. Here is what that side that I showed you at the beginning of the talk with it painted out. And I hope you can see that the actual continuation of the architecture which is established by Thornhill within his dome structure, taking that down all the way down to the Whispering Gallery, and so down the fluted pilasters of the nave, gave a kind of coherence to the whole dome interior, which was actually lost by this, where the dome painting seems to just float off, unconnected really by any decorative treatment to what's below. So we felt that the project as a whole had been extraordinarily successful, and I think we were all very proud of it. And if you think that it looks just inevitable and you wonder what all the fuss was about, that's probably the greatest compliment that you could give to Charles and myself and the rest of the team who delivered this remarkable project. Thank you very much. And back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Martin. That was absolutely fascinating. So we will now have a Q&A session where audience questions will be discussed by the panel. So please send any questions in using the Q&A box, which should appear at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we've got a question to kick us off, and that's for Martin. So how long did it take to design the access equipment, and did you have any problems?
Well, I wouldn't like to say we didn't have problems, but it did take a bit of time. What actually expedited the whole process of the access was finding Ray Gold, who I mentioned earlier, who is a specialist scaffolding engineer. And he, once we'd located him and got him on board and was able to include him in discussions with myself and with Robert Bowles, the cathedral engineer, he was actually able to work fairly rapidly to actually produce the kind of designs in detail. I can't remember quite how long it took. I mean, within the context of the project as a whole, it wasn't very long. It wasn't to say that there weren't teething problems with the actual scaffold as existing, as executed, because I don't know whether you remember the slide particularly, but we had the cables strung from the top, which supported two cross girders at Whispering Gallery level, which had rollers at its ends, so that we could roll the thing round on the Whispering Gallery. It so happened that we hadn't really realized that the Whispering Gallery is not entirely level. The cathedral has settled over time, rather famously settled, but that's a different story. And we hadn't quite realized the significance of the fact that by Sod's law, we had, of course, constructed the first quarter of the scaffolding on the downhill side. So when we came to roll it round, as we thought rather easily one night, we found that we actually couldn't shift the blasted thing at all because it was so damn heavy to roll uphill. And that did cause a few little difficulties one way or another. Of course, the whole scaffolding structure had to be erected at night. A lot of things had to happen at night during this entire project. The cathedral was open entirely during every day. And so things that involved lifting all the component parts of that scaffolding up could only happen from the church floor at night.
An incredible piece of engineering. So we've got a question from Peter Mackenzie, and this is for Charles. But a thank you to Martin. It's a very interesting presentation. Was any preparation of the stonework or plasterwork required, or could the painting be undertaken immediately, Charles?
Good evening. Yes, it was had to be prepared. But we didn't use fillers. We decided that we didn't want to add more sort of filler bases onto the original painting. But what we did do, we put a barrier layer of what was Plexstol, 2 layers. It's an acrylic resin, a restoration resin, and it forms a barrier so that the paint we was putting on didn't eat into the paint that was existing, so that in future, if required, that can easily be removed, certainly far easier than what the paint was removed from the samples.
And we felt, just to add to that, that that was an extremely important aspect of the project, that we shouldn't be destroying the original traces of the Thornhill scheme. And that somebody might come along in future with some kind of special nano computers that may be able to eat paintwork or something, and reveal all the original paintwork, that we shouldn't be spoiling that in any kind of way, so that it had a practical, but as also, if you like, an archaeological significance in providing a layer between Charles's work and the original.
So another question for Martin. Do we know why Penrose painted out the decorative scheme of the tambour at the mid-century period, 1850s?
We don't know specifically, but we know in general terms that by the 1850s, the cathedral had become really disgracefully dirty. And it was being commented on as a kind of national disgrace. Of course, the cathedral had been, open to the atmosphere of London for a long time before even the vaulting was put on the top, and it was heated by coke stoves, which undoubtedly would have put pollutants onto the surface. It was a lead-based paint which Wren put onto the surface originally, which would have discolored considerably and darkened and become a very dirty grey. So that in general terms, the people felt about the cathedral that it was a very drab, disgusting and unworthy kind of place. At the same time, a new dean, a new chapter were coming into their kind of period, and appointed, as I say, from 1852, F.C. Penrose, who was a young architect at the time. So there was a new team there, and the new team rather felt, that the business of decorations not being completed needed to be picked up, but also the kind of theological impact of the cathedral. That these very gloomy pictures by Thornhill up in the dome were not what the evangelical church of the time felt that it should be encouraging its worshippers with. So there was a sort of double-pronged approach, both that the decorations should improve the general appearance of the cathedral, but also they should actually have a different and more contemporary message.
Interesting.
And just to answer the question specifically, Penrose painted the timbre then. We don't know whether that was actually a first coat because he intended to paint over it. Well, we knew that he was putting forward schemes, but we don't know whether he actually painted it out thinking, well, we need to cheer the place up while we actually spend, perhaps several years trying to decide what best to do.
Interesting. So the next question is from Matthew Reed, who asks, were X-rays used to detect the original painted decoration, and did you consider overlays for the restoration work?
Shall I answer that one, Charles, at the beginning? X-rays actually weren't used. We felt we wanted to see the tonalities and the actual colours, and indeed look at the pigments of the original decoration. We were using X-rays and indeed ultraviolet light, both up on the actual dome structure above, but we didn't feel that X-ray would actually teach us anything which we didn't know. By overlays, I'm not quite sure what's considered. Was that a kind of sort of idea of a kind of transfer that you might kind of stick on the top? I'm not quite sure. But I felt that actually the best way of getting the right result was to use an artist of Charles's stature and abilities to actually restore what was there before.
Yeah. So the next question is from Jeremy Musson. How much do you think Wren informed the design choices of the painted architectural decoration? It clearly references the actual architecture and detail.
Hello, Jeremy. Nice to hear from you, and good of you to take part. We know, of course, that Wren was he was both tiring of the cathedral project by the time the end of the century, by the time sort of 1710 came. And also, of course, there was a new dean and chapter coming in who had very different ideas from him. Of course, we do know a lot about what Wren kind of wrote and developed. I mean, we have the great model surviving, which of course gives, which has a painted interior with a coffered dome and painted decoration in it. But that, of course, dates from the early 1670s, so before even the construction of the present cathedral. And Wren's, of course, ideas were constantly changing. But we do, of course, know that he always preferred or held in great high esteem the kind of architecture of the ancients and the kind of therefore the design choice of that kind of painted architectural decoration. And of course, the concept of a painted architectural well, he famously said, didn't he, that when he was shown the designs by the various competing artists for the commission that James Thornhill won, he did say that, of course, actually a painted architectural treatment would be a good deal cheaper and might be preferred by many people. And architectural historians have always kind of taken that as being, you know, and by me, Mr. Wren. But architectural historians love to discuss that particular point, of course.
Very good. So the next question is for Charles. Did you get a feeling for how Thornhill himself actually worked when painting?
Yes, certainly. That was one thing that I did right from the start, from producing the samples, that I went up into the actual dome to analyse the actual brush stroking that he used, and I was immediately getting the feeling he had a very good idea of perspective, that from the floor you wouldn't see the detail, and so he was playing on that perspective with his stroking, that when you are stood sort of 4 or 5 feet from some of the figures, you just can't make out really what they are. They are that the angles are distorted, but looking from afar, they are exactly what he intended. And that, with the actual brush stroking, was something that I felt I did get right with that. And the pigments, certainly with the shading, with the fictive light that Martin was mentioning, that he clearly was using that quite successfully to give this uplift of the light coming up, which we use with the various pigments which we had analysed, which Martin had analysed from the paint chemists, told us which pigments had been used, and so we could use the same pigments which we developed and put into the lead paint, making them all ourselves from powder, suspended and then grated into oil to make the paints.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's actually answered another one of the questions as well, which is thank you. So we've got another question from Isabella Gill Brown. Were there any concerns about the fragility of the paint below the overpaint?
No, a lot of the areas was quite sound. There was very little. The layer that had been applied over the original artwork was fairly stable, and so but also we put this, as I mentioned earlier, this Plextol layer, which is also a stabilizing layer to prevent flaking and such in the future.
Mm.
Yes, I mean, my concern was that the paint was extremely hard, strongly adhered. I mean, hence the difficulty that it took to actually reveal it. It certainly was very well adhered. And that actually contrasts with higher up. The reason why E.T. Paris was employed in the early 1850s was because actually the bottom section of the dome painting had very badly decayed by that time. And that is because, I don't know whether you can recall the cross-section of the cathedral at that point, but the stone gallery connects with the point where the cone, the brick cone comes down, and where the springing of the timber construction for the leaded vault of the dome above all coincide. And at that point, there was clearly an ability for damp to penetrate in from the stone gallery level and affect the paintwork of the bottom of the dome. And I think that, is still very likely to be a continuing problem, because it's very difficult to keep the stone gallery very watertight. But it doesn't seem to have affected the peristyle, the timbre below, because of course that's quite sheltered by a great colonnade of columns on the exterior, so that actually the timbre is quite well recessed from the weather conditions outside the dome.
Mm. So I guess this question really is for both of you. I'll start with Martin. What was your greatest reveal in the old paintings?
What was the greatest reveal? Well, I think, I was going to comment on what Charles said about the choice of paint. And it's always been my view that actually the best way of getting a real kind of match and a continuity of the past is not to apply something sort of new, but is actually to go back to the old techniques, to go back to the old materials, and to go back to the old ways of doing things. And that actually enables you to reconstruct the new treatment, the new application, in a way that would actually sit in a really comfortable and seamless way within the interior. And I suppose, my greatest sort of pleasure out of the whole thing is how successful that has been. I felt that if we had used kind of modern materials and modern techniques and things, that it might have looked different at the beginning, but B, and more importantly, that it would have not be aging in the kind of same way that I think doing it with the traditional techniques and materials ages.
It's the authenticity, isn't it?
Yes, and it's authentic, yes.
So Charles, what was your greatest reveal?
Looking was mainly the use of gilding as opposed to white for highlighting. Is a technique that Thornhill used a lot. That viewing from the floor, you don't really notice the gilding. You just think it's the highlight of the figure, but it's actually gold that he uses rather than a light paint, and working that into. into the actual painting, not as a gilded line as such, but as part of the shading was and highlighting was really quite revealing, and was I was quite impressed about that when I saw it close up, that you don't see that gilding from the floor, or the fineness of it.
I should perhaps have put in a slide. Remiss of me perhaps, but of course Thornhill also painted that section of the top of the cone, which you see through the oculus in his dome, right high above, and he painted that in what you might call an architectural way, with coffering, but with other swags. And those were untouched by any later hand, and therefore gave a very good idea of what Thornhill was kind of dealing with. And, you know, as Charles says, using that technique of gilding, it was good to see, because in the dome itself, E.T. Paris in the early 1850s had done a great deal of repainting and regilding and recovering, a whole lot of it. Extraordinarily done, and very difficult to disentangle what he did as opposed to what Thornhill did, actually. But up in the cone, we think that was original Thornhill work, which acted as a very good model.
Very good. And Sophie Howell asks, what was most enjoyable for you when completing the project? I don't know.
Oh, Charles, go ahead. I'd like to know what you think.
Well, what was mainly that I certainly won't get another project like that. It's the greatest job I've ever worked on, the Cathedral, and the freedom that I was allowed once we discussed everything and sorted out the sample. Then basically, I was left to it, and it was just a joy all the time working there.
Well, that's very good to hear, because of course it's always been my belief that actually the best that you'll get out of an artist or a craftsman is to involve them in the discussion process, involve them in the whole kind of thinking process of the project. But once you've actually done that, you're in their hands. You know, there's nothing more that I can say except, you know, great, you know, thank you, go ahead.
Yeah, excellent. So question from James Grayson, probably to Martin. Were there any dissenting views about how to approach this, and how did you overcome them?
The dissenting views, interestingly, were all right at the beginning of the project. There were some people who felt that the whole idea of cleaning the interior was, you know, not right, and there was no way of, in a way of persuading those people otherwise. But I'm a slightly sort of diffident kind of chap, I suppose. And I mean, I introduced, when we had this initial seminar, I introduced the more kind of what I thought were the more outlandish kind of things, like the painting of the timbre, in a fairly kind of sort of diffident kind of way. And I was really enormously struck and enormously encouraged, of course, by the fact that a number of the people there actually were so strong in their belief that what we were doing was the right way of doing it, and that we should, you know, do it with more courage rather than with less. Having got to that point, because we worked in a very cooperative way, not just with the sort of team of people doing it like Charles, but with all the people who are part of the consenting processes. You know, we had SPAB round, we had English Heritage round, we had the Cathedral Fabric Commission round all the time. So all these people who are part of the approvals, the national approvals process, were all, in a way, becoming quite closely involved in the whole project. And because the project was spread out over quite a number of years, it enabled us to actually, form very good relations with them all, and in fact, always feel as though, they were part of the team in some kind of way.
Yeah, that's excellent. So the next question is from Steve Owen. Can you say a little something about the weight of the temporary works and the loading impact on the structure?
Ooh, you test my memory now. On that drawing, I'm not sure whether I can go back to the slide right now while I'm talking to you, but on that drawing, the cross-section that showed the cross-sections through the scaffolding, the greater weight was taken by the cross beams at the top of at a high level within the lantern. And did it take 43 tons? I think 43,000 kilograms is a figure that I recall. I think Robert Bowles may be listening to this, and I'm afraid he can't probably contribute his knowledge of that. What we did was we put a pulley right up at the top of the lantern, which allowed us to pull these beams up and install them just below that point. They were then took, I think at least they were calculated to take at least 2/3 of the total weight of the whole scaffolding structure. And the other, approximately 1/3, was then distributed by the cross girders at Whispering Gallery level. But certainly the greater part of it was taken from the high point. And of course, if you understand Wren's and Hook's cross-sectional brilliance in the structure of the dome, which is actually another little mini lecture, which I don't have the slides here to support. But what is interesting is that the strongest point for taking great loads within that whole dome structure is the top of the lantern. That's the strongest point, or can carry the greatest amount of weight.
I guess as long as the building is vertical.
Well, yes, it's all part of a parabolic structure.
That's right. So the next question is from Kibby Schaefer. Charles, your work is stunning. Did you have any assistants or apprentices working with you at the time, and do they carry on working today with the knowledge you've passed on?
Yes, I did. If I do cut out, please accept my apologies. The bandwidth has just gone very, very low. So, yes, we have a small company that I employ about between 4 or 5 people of us. So that I do take on assistants, but within the company, we don't take on sort of outside that I prefer to. We've always trained our own people from school age and then taught them in the art of signwriting, which teaches precision, that you know how a letter should be formed rather than just artwork where it's up to interpretation. A letter has to be precise, and so that I always find is very good grounding for using fine brushes and all sort of art brushes that then follow on if you learn that precision first. And that's what I teach.
No, that's excellent. It's actually just gone 8 o'clock, but we have got a few more questions, so we'll carry on a little while longer if that's okay. We'll just do about 3 or 4 and maximum sort of 10 minutes. So I've got another question from Alana Honey. Was there a thought that the project was indulgent? Was it difficult to persuade stakeholders, funders, etc., for the need for this work, Martin?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, and it's one that I ask myself, of course, from time to time. You know, how necessary was this? Of course, I do, you know, I carry the can for that in a way, because when I was appointed Surveyor to the Fabric in 1990, I was, you know, asked to do an initial report. And I was able to kind of say, you know, the cathedral is in actually extraordinarily sound structural state. It's been very well cared for over the years, and very beautifully built in the first instance to the highest standards. But I said at that point, this is 1992, I said I thought that the interior of the cathedral was an incredible disappointment. It's just so dirty and squalid looking, and kind of you know, you go in the doors and your spirits sink. In fact, I said it's a bit more like a railway station than a cathedral. And to my amazement, the dean and chapter at the time agreed with me and said, you know, we rather feel like that about the place, and thank you for putting your finger on it. And we think that as a great national cathedral, as a great national institution, we ought to take what you say rather seriously. But we've got various other tasks that we certainly must do first. We must do all sorts of things. And I worked for 21 years in the cathedral, and the number of works that we actually did was enormous in all parts of the cathedral, and covered all sorts of things like putting new loos for visitors, and a new cafe for our tourists, and education rooms for the children. And I mean, amazing number of different projects that we did. A lot of disability discrimination, you know, work, accessibility projects, and all of those things. But one of the things that actually caught the imagination of a lot of people was what a wonderful thing it would be to make the whole interior actually sort of glow and shine again. And of course, if you've started in a place like St. Paul's Cathedral, which is a very unified interior, you can't just do one bit and say we've done that bit and the rest can just stay dirty and drab. You've got to do the whole thing. And so that inevitably the dome and the timbre were, if you like, sucked into it. And of course, you know, I was the person spending the money, not raising it, which is a position of great joy and privilege. But the interesting thing is that the actual cost of doing all that work to the interior, you know, struck a chord. It struck a chord with a number of people. It struck a chord with one particular individual who gave an enormously generous donation to the entire internal cleaning project, which is what enabled it to take off.
That's absolutely fascinating. So Robert Bowles has commented in the Q&A that the load on the cross beams in the lantern was about 24 tonnes.
Right.
So
that's the cross beam in the land. Oh, 24. I think I remembered the figures the wrong way around. I thought it was 42, but it was 24. Well, there you are. Robert Bowles was the engineer involved, so he knows.
He knows.
Thank you, Robert.
So we'll do one more question. Martin mentioned that some tasks had to be done at night. How did you go about scheduling the works and coordinating with the conservators working on the paintings under the dome?
Well, the things that had to be done at night were the things which involved the cathedral floor, the main body of the cathedral. So that things like bringing the scaffolding in, bringing materials in and lifting them up to the scaffold was things that had to be done at night. And the actual erection of the scaffolding, because of course you couldn't have scaffolders actually working over the head of the public walking underneath. but the way we actually designed the scaffolds throughout the entire job of cleaning the entire cathedral, it just wasn't just the dome area. The way we designed them was that to actually enable the conservators and the work staff to be able to work during the day. And so there were constraints like noise of machines and so on, which had to be reduced and curtailed in various ways. But basically, the idea was that most of the work was actually carried out during daytime. And of course, from Charles's point of view, of course, it was essential that he worked by daylight most of the time anyway.
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, that's all we've got time for tonight, but I'd like to thank Martin for a wonderful presentation, and also thanks to Charles for joining us for the Q&A session. And thank you all for watching and participating tonight. I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's talk. I'd also like to take the opportunity to invite non-members to join us as members. We welcome supporters as well as practitioner members. You can sign up via the website, where you'll also find more details about the benefits of membership. We can't do this without you. Thanks again to all our panelists, and thank you for watching. Have a good night.